Welcome back after lunch. I'm Phyllis Blumberg, and I'm the facilitator for this session. What I want to do is introduce myself and talk about a little bit about what I do, and then we'll go down the panel and talk about their work. And then the plan for the session is each person will have about 5 minutes to present. I'm going to pose some questions after that, and then we're going to open it up to you, and we hope that you have a lot of wonderful questions for us. We have a very distinguished panel today, and I was about to say distinguished audience, and I suspect that's also true.
That's true, too.
Anyway, I'm Phyllis Blumberg. I'm at the University of the Sciences. It's a health sciences and sciences university. I've been talking about learning center teaching now for about 10, 15 years, and before that I was talking about problem-based learning, which we didn't even know was a learning-centered focus. I've written a guide for faculty on how to implement learning-centered teaching. So I want to go down the panel next. We have Mary Ellen Weimer, who I have been proud to say has been my mentor for many years. She's a professor emeritus from Penn State at Berk's campus. She's a retired faculty member, and she is an amazing writer. If you ever find anything that she's written, read it, because she's worth it. She's the editor of a very, very practical newsletter that's called Teaching Professor Newsletter, and she's written lots of books on learning-centered teaching. And then we have Tom Corley, who is a retired English professor. He's been teaching for 40 years or more, and even though he's retired, he's still teaching. This is called the busman's holiday because he loves teaching so much. He's been teaching at Bridgewater State University. In addition to teaching, he's also a scholar. He is the a scholar on Samuel Johnson, and he's taught that course and many others for 40 years. And when we had a telephone conversation, his enthusiasm for teaching was just overwhelming. And then we have Beth McGinnis Kavanaugh, and I'm happy to say there's a woman who teaches physics and engineering mechanics. Yay! At Springfield Technical College, community college, and she's one of the principal creators of Through My Windows project. I'm sure she's going to be talking about that. She is such an outstanding teacher that the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching awarded her the Professor of the Year for 2014 in Massachusetts, so I'm sure we have lots of good things to hear from her. And finally, we have Paul Stoneley, who's the CEO of WACE, which I had never heard about, but it stands for World Association for Cooperative Education. So what he's doing is advancing cooperative and work-integrated education at the University of Massachusetts at Lowell. So it fits very well with some of the things that we heard this morning. Do you pronounce it WACE or WACE?
WACE.
WACE. The focus of WACE is to acknowledge and to embrace all forms of experiential learning that are utilized by industry and educational institutions, and to prepare for the next generation of global professionals. So that's our panel. We have amazing people here, and I think we're going to have a great session. I just want to set a framework for what I think of as learning-centered teaching, and I'm hearing the conference this morning. I think there's differences, but this is the framework that I'm doing. The first is this is a session on faculty. So why should faculty implement learning-centered teaching? To me, it's very much of a research-based strategy. We heard this morning about we need research-based strategies. There's a fabulous research-based, comes from the research in cognitive sciences. It comes from the research in learning theories, and just how students learn. The benefits of learning-centered teaching are students have an incredible motivation to learn. They're not turned off. They are the ones who are asking the questions. They're the ones who want to learn. There's a greater satisfaction with school, and then it fits very well with the theme of this conference, which is completion. When students are motivated, when students are learning, and they create their own knowledge bases, they're motivated, then there's a higher graduation rate. There's also American Psychological Association has come out with principles that they accepted across the entire the whole association membership that they call the learner-centered principles. There's about 30 of them, no, a little less, about 25, which basically say this is how we should all be teaching when we're teaching psychology. And if the psychologists think we should be teaching from learning-centered teaching, I would say we definitely should be doing that. So what are learning-centered students like? They're motivated to learn, as I said. They're engaged with their learning. They create meaning out of their learning because they're the ones who are grappling with the problems. They're the ones who are exploring and reading and talking to each other. They are involved in making choices about their learning. And most important, I think, is that it's a social enterprise. We learn much better in forums like this where we can talk to each other than when we're simply learning on our own. People ask the best questions, we have to answer them, we have to talk about it. Students have to take responsibility for their learning, and most times I think the faculty take far too much responsibility for learning. When faculty take responsibility for learning, we organize how they're going to learn, what they're going to learn, how they're going to be tested, and instead if we push this responsibility for the students, then the students take the responsibility and do it well. But the students don't know how to do that, so we have to foster it, we have to teach students how to do that. It employs a lot of instructional methods. They're not one signature methodology, which is learning-centered teaching. So I want to explore with this panel various faculty roles in planning considerations of courses. So things I'm going to challenge you to talk about is how should content be taught? What helps students to learn better? How can students become responsible for their learning? How can you assess or promote the learning that takes place? And what skills should faculty help students to master? And how to meaningfully engage students with the content. So I hope we can, and I will pass this around if you need it. Those are the questions that I have for you. So the plan is we're going to move down the line with everybody talking for about 5 minutes, and I'm the timekeeper. So Mary Ellen, why don't you get started?
Okay. Well, I finally feel like my day is turning around because there's a drape here in front, and you cannot see that I am wearing sneakers and not very professional socks. But you can see that I'm trying to do this in my weekend Henley. I have a nice wool jacket and slacks, but they're over at the airport. We did not arrive at the same time, and we haven't gotten connected. So I was dealing with that issue this morning, and then I decided I would check in for my flight out tonight, only to discover that I had made reservations for a flight that left at 5:45 a.m. as opposed to 5:45 p.m. So it's been one of those days, but I really am happy to be here, and I'll be happier when I get home and have clean underwear. But I did really enjoy the sessions this morning, and think that this is such a really good topic. So I have written a book on learner-centered teaching, which is in 2 editions. I must acknowledge that I wrote the book when I worked for Carl Lovett when he was our chief academic officer at the Penn State campus where I worked. And I don't think if it had been for Carl, I probably would have gotten the book done. So I'm really happy that he's here. As my engineering husband would point out, the book on learner-centered teaching has yet to make the New York Times best seller list. But I think that one of the things that, so I think, and I think that Scott talked a little bit about this morning too, is that learner-centered, the moniker, has become sort of trendy. And so it's applied to a variety of different things now. Learner-centered strategies, a learner-centered technique, or she's a learner-centered teaching. It's a learner-centered course, we have a learner-centered program, or as we're talking about today, we have learner-centered institutions. And what I think has happened is that widespread use of the term along with that has come some sort of definitional looseness, so that now when I do most of my work with faculty, I find a lot of the time they are sort of conflating ideas of active learning with learner-centered teaching. And while I think a lot of active learning strategies are learner-centered, not all of them are, and they're not learner-centered automatically. So in my 5 minutes, I want to talk about 5 things that I think or characteristics that differentiate learner-centered teaching from active learning and from teaching in general, okay? So the first one is that teaching is learner-centered when students are engaged in the hard, messy work of learning, all right? And this is Phyllis's notion of students assuming the responsibility for learning. And I think what has happened is that to the extent that a lot of us are teaching students who are not terribly well prepared for college, they don't really know what good learning is. And in our well-motivated intention to help them succeed, we have started doing a lot of the learning tasks for students. So the simple illustration that I often use is the last 5 minutes of class when we're summarizing. Well, who's doing the summary? Well, the person who is the person who already knows how to do summaries. Okay, so who needs to learn how to summarize? The students do. All right. So students are engaged in the hard, messy work of learning. They are not sort of sitting passively, but are engaged. Secondly, students are being taught learning skills explicitly. All right. This is about the balance between content and process. It's the difference between covering content and using it, all right? And I think learner-centered teaching focuses on using the content to develop those kind of lifelong learning skills. In other words, we're not imagining that students are learning to think critically by virtue of being in the presence of someone who does, all right? The best way to learn how to think critically is by using your brain to try to learn how to think critically, okay? Number 3, students are given some control over the learning processes. As Phyllis mentioned, teachers make virtually all of the decisions about learning for students, what they're going to learn in the course, how they're going to learn it, tests, papers, whatever, the pace at which they're going to learn it, the conditions under which they're going to learn it, in class without their cell phones on, blah, blah, blah. And then teachers certify whether or not students have learned it. And so what's left for students? Learning it, okay? And so even though we have this, we exercise this enormous amount of power over learning processes, we being teachers, we still can't guarantee what the bottom line is, and that's the learning. And that's because teachers can't learn anything for students. 4th, students are reflecting, as in thinking about both what they are learning and how they are learning it. I think that students do not have good understandings of learning, and I don't think that most students have encountered themselves as learners. Oh yes, one more minute. Okay, that was generous, Phyllis. I think you gave me a minute and a half there. Okay, but I think that we want learner-centered teachers are getting students, are trying to develop an awareness in students of themselves as learners. And finally, teaching is learner-centered when students and teachers are learning from and with each other, okay? And so, of course, students are learning from the teacher. The teacher has the sort of expertise, and that is totally legitimate. Students are also learning from and with each other, and I think oftentimes teachers underestimate how much and how well students can learn from and with each other. And finally, teachers are learning from students, okay? Not every day. If you're teaching an introductory level class, the chance of a student teaching you something about it is not very good, but you know what? You can learn from every class that you teach is something more about teaching and learning. And you know, this morning, I have this last 30 seconds here, pet peeve about how we talk about teacher training. You know, I think teaching is really way, way more complex. You know, we can train people how to drive buses, we can train people how to give CPR, but teaching is a much more complicated, dynamic sort of thing. And so until teachers start thinking about it as an intellectually rich, scholarly activity, okay, that they learn in the same way that they might learn about content in their discipline, I think that training really devalues what it is that we're doing. And I've got to say that learning to be a learner-centered teacher is a very challenging proposition. Thanks.
Thank you. We're not going to take up any questions. We're going to move right along, and so we have questions at the end. Tom?
The motto for my 50-year teaching career comes from Geoffrey Chaucer, and gladly would he learn and gladly teach. I love teaching and scholarship, and see no gulf between my life with books and my life with undergraduates at Bridgewater State University. I consider myself a humanist, curious about all arts and sciences, all people and places in this fascinating world. During my doctoral studies at Harvard as a Woodrow Wilson Fellow, I chose to focus on the age of Samuel Johnson from 1709 to 1784 for my scholarly specialty. Although change is always with us, Johnson never doubted the abiding vitality and validity of traditional humanistic learning, which I view as fundamental to our successfully navigating our challenging post-industrial society caught up with technological innovation and social upheaval at home and abroad. I believe that on average our institutions do a wonderful, magical job of educating, socializing, and acculturating our diverse citizenry. All my classes are filled to capacity, but I had to learn the art of teaching the way my dad taught me how to swim, by plunging me into the deep of doing it, catch as catch can. No one bothered to train me in college instruction when I pursued my fancy Harvard PhD, and few other graduate schools provide such training today. Harvard's rigid, sage on a stage lecture approach would be boring to undergraduates. An eminent lecturer would pontificate twice a week, and absolutely no questions were allowed. I remember when a co-ed came in late and interrupted the lecture. The professor rudely shouted, "Get out!" and forced the poor woman to leave the lecture hall. Interaction with a senior teacher almost never happened. I quickly learned to adapt to the needs of undergraduates. After all, students always come first, and I remind them that they pay my salary and that I better produce, or they can Donald Trump me with the words, "You're fired." Learner-centered teaching, rooted in 1990s pedagogy, postdated my experience by many years. I stress student-centered instruction, but use a lecture approach for the sake of efficient content coverage, especially when I must introduce unknown writings which I discovered in my research in Britain and India. In fact, most classes at Bridgewater are lecture-oriented, but even with this limitation, I adhere to Mary Ellen Weimer's fine guideline in her book, Learner-Centered Teaching, that, quote, "A student is challenged to have ownership in the learning experience as opposed to passive learning," end quote. I also agree that it is my obligation to know my students, to interact with them by eye contact, walking down aisles, and after-class availability, to respect their opinions, to be relevant and exciting, interlarding humor, anecdotes, and storytelling, and to offer provocative questions, eliciting problem-solving answers in class, in several term papers, and in essay exams. After all, my undergraduates are not my children, but my fellow adults, worthy of my fullest attention and scholarly fellowship. As Phyllis Bloomberg reminds us in her 2008 publication, Developing Learner-Centered Teachers, quote, "Learning is a social process," end quote, that requires professors to be facilitative rather than condescendingly didactic if we hope to keep our students awake and involved. Here is a recent example of my teaching, and I'm going to close with this example. I developed a course of my own entitled The Literature of Travel. It covers 5 centuries of travel from Columbus's first letter about the New World through Buzz Aldrin's account of landing on the moon, and includes Utopia, Gulliver's Travels, Johnson's A Journey to Scotland, Captain Cook's Pacific Voyages, The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, Walden, and Conrad's Heart of Darkness. This course fulfills the general education literature requirement of 20 non-specialist students, many of them seniors, delaying until the bitter end a reading and writing intensive course demanding periodic term papers and essay exams. My great book approach to content fosters lively discussion and is aimed at enhancing an individual's rounded development, intellectual growth, and civic-mindedness for a stable and yet forward-moving society. We concentrate on the dynamic quality of human nature, our ways of knowing and problem-solving in confrontations with diverse cultures, and the possibilities and limitations of human discovery in a widening global picture marked by scientific exploration and imperialistic exploitation. I use visuals frequently to show students the actual terrain of their readings, whether it be the moon, the Highlands of Scotland, or Australia and Tahiti. I ask them to talk about their own travels. My students also joined me in resolving a major scholarly problem about the final book of the classic, Gulliver's Travels. Namely, are Gulliver's rational but emotionless horses Swift's ideal for humanity to imitate, as some scholars maintain? We shared ideas about human nature, and then students listed on the chalkboard good and bad qualities of Swift's rational horses in 2 columns, for all to see the predominant inhumanity of these ultimately forbidding creatures. All this valuable discussion made for vital scholarship in the round, and students are at its center.
Okay, thank you. All right, our next speaker is Beth.
Okay, hi everyone. As Phyllis mentioned initially, I'm the PI in an NSF grant project called Through My Window, and I'd like to talk to you a little bit about that first because it has directly informed my teaching. I'm in year 4 of a 5-year grant, and it's been like a 3 to 4 year very rigid PD project up to this point. So Through My Window is an engineering education project for children and young teens. Again, it's funded by NSF, and it's a linked project on which I work with 2 professors from Smith College on. It has 3 components. It's multimedia. One component is a young adult novel. One component is an online learning environment, which we call a series of learning adventures. And one component is offline curriculum. And one of the reasons I want to talk about it is because it has the characteristics of a learner-centered environment. And as I mentioned earlier, some of these characteristics I am now applying in my classes at STIC. The design of the learning environment is based on 2 approaches. One is imaginative education, in which well-written story is used to frame concepts. The other is knowledge building, which is a collective learning environment that fosters continual idea improvement and deals with very open-ended questions that we call knowledge questions. And in the case of engineering, deals with very open-ended and big, relevant engineering ideas. So the first learning adventure on Through My Window deals with artificial intelligence, which is a field very ripe for open-ended questions. And children, again, this is for boys and girls, although directed primarily towards girls, can explore artificial intelligence on a learning adventure in which they're asked questions like, what is intelligence? What is hard for machines to do? Can a machine brain or an artificial brain ever replace a human brain? You know, will robots ever be smarter than humans? And they're directed to these questions multiple times. So they answer them, and then they're taken through some steps in which may or may not make them change their minds about their definition, and then they're asked to reflect and go back. They're also in a closed environment with their classmates, or in the case of an after-school program, the other children in the program, in which they can share these ideas. And again, that's where the idea improvement comes in. So as a group, as a collective group, they're trying to move and elevate knowledge about artificial intelligence. Now, just as an example, we ran or implemented this fully with 700 students this summer in Bridgeport, which is next to Springfield, which is where I'm from, probably the most struggling school district in the country. 700 students in summer programs, i.e. Through My Window was facilitated by after-school staff, not credentialed educators, who had 2 hours of teaching or 2 hours of training in how to do it. So the preliminary data suggests significant improvement in attitudes about engineering, significant improvement in understanding of what engineering is about, and in terms of the questions, which the students journal online, so the students journal electronically, and we can look at all of their responses, significant changes in the depth and complexity of what they're writing, which is pretty amazing given the setting. The point is that the narrative provides a buy-in for students to become engaged, and the knowledge building fosters a very learner-centered environment. So, fast forward to physics at STCC, where I have about 40 students this semester, a spectrum of abilities, a spectrum of majors, everything from ultrasound students to pre-engineering students and pharmacy students. Most of whom are not too happy to be there, to be honest. It's a requirement, I don't kid myself. There are very few students in my class who are taking it for fun. So what I've done this semester, in addition to more traditional components of the class, we have lecture, we have lab, we have hands-on, work in class, we have group work, we have all of that. But I've introduced knowledge building to my students. And for them, there are two things. First of all, the stories or the narrative is not quite as convenient as with kids. And what we're finding, or what I'm finding with them, is that the story has to be their own. So what they did this semester is come up with their own sets of questions based on whatever experience, observations, what have you, that they have. Some of the questions they're exploring, and by the way, good knowledge questions usually start with how or why. Some of the questions that they've come up with are, how does gravity affect aging? How do we experience time? Why does my guppy propel itself through the fish tank differently than my goldfish? Why do rocks, or how do rocks skip across water? And these are just an example of several different questions, several different overall topics, I guess, related to mechanics, which is what they're learning this semester. Now, they do their knowledge building on software called Knowledge Forum. So Knowledge Forum is an online two-dimensional workspace in which they can link to one another, so they can post questions, they can link to other posts, they can link laterally, they can link below posts, they can link above posts. So they can physically, what you have is a physical space that actually shows some thinking and some idea creation going on. And again, the goal is for them to elevate their ideas and come to what we call rise aboves, where questions are honed, topics are really, sort of honed in on, and they come to some conclusion on their own, of course with my help. So I think I'm out of time, but that's it.
Thank you. Our final
Sure.
speaker is Paul, who's going to bring it to a slightly different level, outside the classroom.
Well, thank you, and it's my pleasure to be here. Those 5 to 7 minutes go by extremely quickly, so I'm a little nervous about getting all my thoughts across. First thing I wanted to say is Mary Ellen started with a comment about her sneakers and socks. I just wanted to mention that it's good. I'm happy to be in Boston. I have my Boston tie. Now, it happens to be Boston Red Sox, and given that they were in last place this year, we won't spend any more time talking about them. We're just hopeful for next year. I wondered, being the last in the panel, as well as following Nancy Zimpher, who is a board member, Board of Trustees for my organization, if there would be anything left for me to talk about in regard to experiential learning. So I just wanted to share a little bit about what we do at WACE. I'm the CEO. I don't work for UMass Lowell. I have an office there, and I have an office in Thailand, Sweden. In the summer, we opened our 4th office in Japan. So I have the privilege of doing a lot of global traveling. The first thing I thought about when I was invited to come to the conference and speak is what's been stated earlier today. We all, I believe, think that we come from learner-centered institutions. I spent 10 years at the University of Denver, and I thought it was very learner-centered in the Graduate School of Business. Then I went to Cambridge College for 10 years, and I realized there are many other practices that I learned about at Cambridge College that are very much learner-centered. I want to mention something about definition. There's a lot of confusion when we talk about co-ops, internships, work-integrated learning. The organization I represent, we created a term that did not exist. We wanted to come up with something new so we could use around the world. We call it Cooperative and Work-Integrated Education, CWIE. And by that, we embrace all forms of work-integrated learning, co-op, internships, practica, undergraduate research, service learning, community service, etc. We try to spend very little time on defining these models because we realize we will never reach agreement, and that isn't the most important part of our work. My remarks this afternoon are really shaped on three premises or three beliefs. The first is I believe that all learner-centered institutions should offer some form or forms of CWIE, co-ops or undergraduate research, internships, et cetera. I just mentioned a definition. There's I think, a very good definition that was established in 1906 by an engineer at the University of Cincinnati, and I'll just read that to you. He was talking about cooperative education. It joins theory with practice, links education with industry through knowledge and experience. So we use that somewhat as a baseline definition, at least, of cooperative education. The second premise that I believe is co-op and internships in all forms of work-integrated learning is growing in the United States as well as globally. NACE reported for the class of 2014 that over 60% of the students had completed at least one internship during their studies. In a similar poll, Gallup poll, it stated that 78% of college presidents really believe, and this is the United States, really believe in the value of internships, yet only 38% of those college presidents said that we do a very good job in offering internships in cooperative education to our students. Some of the skills that we talk about connected with internships and co-op are what many of us refer to as the soft skills, are certainly very, very important skills. Like we had talked about earlier today, critical thinking, teamwork, personal development. And in that same survey of presidents, 90% of the presidents said that these skills are very, very important to their undergraduate students, yet only 40% of those presidents said that I feel we are doing a very effective job in teaching those skills at our university. The reason why I cite this is we often refer to these kinds of skills as emerging from experiential learning opportunities. The third and last premise, and I think perhaps the most important, is that faculty, and I added academic advisors, must be significantly involved in the design and delivery of internships in cooperative education, undergraduate research within their campuses. It's I think, absolutely essential. You can see the difference in universities where faculty disengaged from these kinds of experiences versus where faculty right in the midst of providing these opportunities to students. I think faculty should be involved in the various stages of experiential ed, and I'll just briefly outline. One is the preparation of students prior to going on to an internship or a co-op assignment. Faculty should be very involved in the reflection of what the student is learning, how the student is learning during their internship. Certainly, faculty and academic advisors need to be involved in the assessment of the learning and the assessment of the learning outcomes. And we like to use the word, you might have noticed when I said work-integrated learning, the word integrated we think is very important, that the integration of the learning while the student is off campus is critical as it's being integrated into their curriculum. Sometimes we call that mapping learning outcomes to the curriculum. We just finished a 3-day institute on the assessment of learning outcomes of experiential learning held at Drexel University last week. And I see that over the last recent years that this is becoming very, very important to faculty members and academic administrators. And finally, I would say that it's very important for faculty and academic advisors to stay connected with the students while the student is off campus, sometimes for up to 6 months. And the last remark is that I believe our learner-centered institutions should formally recognize in one way, one fashion or another, the value of these experiential learning opportunities. So thank you, and hopefully I was on time.
Yes, thank you. So I'd like to pose a couple of questions to the panel. We represent different disciplines, from English to science, engineering, communications, business. I'm in psychology. And you might be thinking, well, how does this apply to my discipline? So why don't we spend a minute or two talking about what does learner-centered teaching look like in your own discipline? And why don't we start from the reverse end? So Paul, why don't you talk about it from...
Okay, well, I would address that from more the organizational perspective, where I'm not representing a single college or a university. But I'll share something that we learned through a research study. Many people in American higher education believe that internships, and especially co-op, are for engineers. And we did a national high school guidance counselor survey, and they said, well, the co-op is fine, but it really only works with engineers. Well, that's a myth, and that's not correct. Second is business. It works very well in business, but we also believe, and I think in some instances, most importantly, these kinds of experiences should be made available to students in the humanities and in the liberal arts. Sometimes in our field, we say that those where many of the challenges are, but what we're talking about with co-ops and internships and research, we're talking about all disciplines.
Okay, thank you.
I think in science and in particular engineering, there needs to be a focus on ideas, big ideas. And I think that's often lost when students are really struggling with technical material. Having earned a couple of engineering degrees, there's no field, I'll go out on a limb here and say there is no other field in which students are taught in a more traditional way. You know, the professor lectures, you go home, you do some book problems, questions are a sign of weakness, move on. I mean, that was pretty much what it was like. So teaching, teaching now and trying to drill down on some of those ideas makes me realize that I really missed out in terms of my own education. So I think that the focus needs to be on big ideas. There needs to be some context and some framing given to the material that we're teaching in those types of courses, and I think that's key. And I think those ideas can be extended to include social, cultural, economic, all sorts of impacts that engineering has in particular. In physics, again, letting students kind of direct their own learning, giving them the motivation, giving them the buy-in with their own questions, their own stories, with which they can explore the content that we're, supposed to be teaching.
I decided, because I'm student-centered, that I'd ask the students what they thought about learner-centered learning. Because in some of the classrooms, particularly among the newer faculty that are hired and are teaching, they have a purely learner-centered situation in which the students are in roundtable groups, they're teaching each other, and I asked them what they thought of it, because I'm not a pure learner-centered oriented teacher, as I think I gave you a proper idea. I use it, but I don't use it purely. The students believe that the approach, the learner-centered approach, must be qualified according to the discipline. For example, one student mentioned that in a child development class, an education major, that it worked very, very well having this kind of one-on-one student teaching student. But there were many others that had complaints. They said it's slow and it's inexpert in the process, and there isn't enough input from the professors with the kind of professional knowledge that they crave and demand. They especially found in technology courses, and I have not used technology much in my classroom, they said it can be very impersonal, very confusing. The teacher stays out of it. They're expected to learn everything from it on their own, talk to each other, and they said it's the blind leading the blind. And so I'm sorry to tell you that I didn't get a unanimously approval verdict on this whole issue.
Okay. Well, that pretty much trashed my book premises. Not really, though, because
Not at all.
I think
Not
that
at all.
I think that we're talking about learner-centered teaching. All right, and so it is not an abrogation of professional responsibilities that are associated with being a teacher. Remember, my first point was that students need to be involved in the hard, messy work of learning, all right? And so I think, my response would be, we were talking a little bit about this at lunch too, is that teachers are not, the expertise of the teacher is not removed from a learner-centered classroom. The question is, how do we get students to recognize and make use of teacher expertise. Does that happen best through lecture, or does that happen best through the messiness of active learning? And I believe it happens best through the messiness of active learning, because at that point, when students are confused, when the blind are leading the blind, and hands are raised up in the air, I can intervene and direct that learning, asking a student a question or providing an answer. My old friend Larry Spence is a political science person. He and I are both retired. We have breakfast together and argue loudly about things. But Larry has one simple sort of way of asking this, which I think makes a good point. And his point is, when you've got a question, all right, which question are you most motivated to answer? The question you're asking, or the question the teacher is asking you? And so I think those of us that are advocates of learner-centered teaching are simply trying to create those kind of learning conditions in which the students are asking the questions rather than the teachers.
I want to turn it a little bit more toward, this morning that we heard a lot about return on investment, and the number one thing that can be return on investment is support for the student, advising for the student, helping the student to succeed. So beyond the role in the classroom and beyond your role as a teacher, what are your roles as a teacher in a learner-centered environment? And anybody can take a crack at that.
Well, I think obviously advising is key, number one. I think that faculty need more resources to advise well and to do it better. But certainly I think that faculty take advising very seriously. I also think that modeling behavior or modeling, I want to say learning, there's a term that Thomas Friedman wrote in an article about, the article, excuse me, I'm all over the place. The article was called How to Get a Job at Google. And one of the terms in that article was intellectual humility. And I think modeling that for students is really important. I really do. So I think the back and forth, the interaction, the learning from students is key. And I think if we can model that, we're giving them some good skills to take out into the workplace. Teaching them how to ask questions, either in class or outside of class, teaching them how to find answers, teaching them that some things are not answerable or have very open-ended answers or solutions, which is fine. But yeah, I think, I'll stop now.
The metaphor that I often defer to, descriptive of a teacher's role in the learner-centered classroom, is gendered, so my apologies to the male persons. But I love the idea of the teacher as the midwife, there at the birth of learning. And what I like about that metaphor, why I think it's so powerful, is that the midwife doesn't give birth, all right? And the teacher doesn't do the learning. But the teacher has done a lot of other learning. In fact, the teacher has learned these very things that the students are going to learn. So the teacher brings all that sort of expertise, where we are in the process. Yes, this hurts, it's confusing, it will be over. And at the same time, the teacher as midwife is there to experience the joy when someone does give birth, as in understand something, and those light bulbs go on in the classroom. And I think the midwife metaphor is also a beautiful illustration of support, of someone who's there alongside as you are trying to struggle through something that's difficult.
I'd like to add, Mary Ellen, you've mentioned something about the challenges and messiness of active learning. And I really believe that the experiences we provide our students when they leave campus, it's very engaging in active learning. And one of the models that I've seen demonstrated at many universities around the world is that the student has the opportunity to really learn from and stay connected with three key individuals. One is his or her faculty member, academic advisor, and we really encourage that connection to be strong throughout these 3 months or 6 months. A student also has their supervisor at work. It could be in the lab or at work or at a company or an agency. So they learn and can be supported by their supervisor. And the third, that I think is quite important, is colleges often set up a mentor program where there may be another intern that's already completed the assignment, or maybe has been there a little bit longer than you, or perhaps might even be back on campus, and the student can be supported by a mentor. And when you put those three together, that's a pretty powerful dynamic for supporting the student and I think supporting the learning.
Yes, I agree. I think it's a wonderful, Mary Ellen, analogy that a teacher is a midwife. And how would you like to give birth with a part-time teacher, or a part-time midwife? I think the most important question, the major problem in higher education right now, is the fact that 78% of all college professors in the United States, public, private, religious, affiliated, are part-time adjunct teachers. And the salary is anywhere from $4,000 to $15,000 a semester if they can find enough jobs. And how can you expect part-time teachers to work well on Paul's front, to work well on Mary Ellen's front, and to give the kind of care that every student deserves when most of them have no place permanent to go? That's the real crisis, and it's not being addressed anywhere because it's saving the presidents, the administration money to have this kind of gypsy class of underpaid, unstable workplace teachers, and they do a magnificent job, but that's the major problem in higher education right now, and it should be addressed, and something should be done for it.
Okay, I think we've heard a number of different ideas, perspectives. Now I'd like to open it up to you. You could come forward and use one of our mics. That mic might be working, or if your voice can project, by all means project it. So we're opening it up to general questions now. You can either address the question to all of us, or you can ask it to one particular person. And I think students today don't think they have to go and get that check off, make sure that every one of those courses is correct and they've paid their fees and they've returned their library books and all those things, and wonder, why didn't I graduate? And the parents wonder, why am I paying another semester tuition? Another question? Yes?
Oh, he was pointing at that person over there.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I'm Chuck Gregory, Southern Maine Community College. What do you folks see as the role of the higher ed administrator supporting and facilitating this type of learning environment?
Well, I'd be willing to begin. I see it beginning with the President's office, that President and Provost, to me, are the two critical players that at the top of the university must support these initiatives. I think if they don't, it won't be supported by faculty and deans and department chairs. And I can see a very, very significant difference when I visit a college or a university where experiential education is embedded in the university, and most definitely the top senior academic administrators support that in message, in financial resources, et cetera. So that's where I think it begins.
I think there's a lot of really pragmatic policies, practices that can be very supportive of this as well. I think it was Scott this morning who mentioned that if you are, if you're doing some innovation within a course, that you get excused from course evaluations. I think that the research is really clear that for a mid-career faculty, the repeated administration of most student rating forms does not, the amount of those ratings does not change. So if you let people have some time out to gather formative information about their teaching and learning, I think that's really good. I think that there ought to be a much greater presence of resources on teaching and learning and expectations that faculty will, sort of learn about teaching and learning the same way they keep current in their disciplines. It's all right at a lot of places to teach for many years and never read anything about teaching and learning, and there is, I think, a very, very rich literature. I'm not, talking about my books here, but every discipline has a pedagogical periodical, and those publications, the caliber of those have really changed. I'm consistently amazed that faculty don't know what the pedagogical periodical is, even within their own discipline.
I think there's three roles that administrators can play, and it has to come from the top. One is strategic planning. We have in our document at my university that we will teach in a learning-centered environment, and 2 of our colleges have it within their strategic plan. And because it's part of the strategic plan, it helps to have that works. I think it has to be a policy that in annual evaluations, you have to be looking at how you're teaching, and not just student evaluation forms, but looking at whether or not they're using learning-centered teaching. And as somebody suggested this morning, that the promotion and tenure documents should pay more emphasis on teaching and less on research. And if they look at teaching, they should be looking at learning-centered teaching.
At Bridgewater State, there is an Office of Teaching and Learning. Robin Torosian is the director. That's been in place, and that's the main thoroughfare for trying to take care of faculty, to teach the new learner-centered approaches and so forth, to foster that. And there are many, many other things. Every 3rd semester, an adjunct faculty member is evaluated by the English department chair as far as, their status to stay on. Less frequently for a person seeking promotion who's tenured, but there are Saturday scholarly conversations among faculty, presentations for the English department, adjunct orientation. The college gives about $50,000 to $75,000 a year to try to have students pursue scholarly projects and go to a conference and to present their papers to give them experience in their junior and senior year. The problem with all of this is that it's purely voluntary in almost all cases, and it's not something that that faculty have much time for. I'm not saying they're not interested. They're wonderful teachers, adjunct, full-time. I don't mean that, but they're just so busy. They're just so busy. And one of the problems that I've heard from learner-centered, and Mary Ellen, this is the one thing, it works best if you have small classes. It works best if you have a small college. In large situations, we have so many students to have to bring through, to raise up, and notice I'm avoiding the word process because they're not machines, they're human beings, okay? It takes a lot of teaching. It takes a lot of teaching to do a learner-centered classroom because you have to, from the background, watch and make sure things are being controlled, but you can't be, if they're ventriloquist, in charge of the operation. So it's actually far more demanding, and you need small classes. And you've already seen how, from the conversations today, money is always the big problem, the ultimate factor behind everything. And so I believe fully in learner-centered education. I don't believe there is as much of a cleavage with the lecture. We tend to say, lecture, nobody's paying any attention to the students. That's false. Everybody would be sleeping on me if that was the case. You have to try to work best with what we have, and I do believe, on average, the best is leading to very, very good things that we're doing. But it's voluntary, and you're not going to have the same enforced. The
Right.
good news is
Right.
that the young professors are tending to come in with that kind of approach. But
Well, the latest research that I've seen, 60% of new faculty are still listing the lecture as their primary
Didn't know that,
instructional
Mary Ellen.
method.
Yeah.
That's work of Marty Finkelstein's big, huge survey. And I also would pick a little bit, Tom, on class size, because I do think that there are learner-centered approaches that can be used in, in larger class. And there's plenty of examples in the literature, particularly in the STEM, in some of these big introductory, like biology courses, of faculty members who really are, using clickers or using a variety of different devices to get to. But the point that I do agree with you on is that it's very, I think, oversimplification to say, I'm in favor of active learning and I'm opposed to lecture. It's about a better balance. For me, it's about a better balance between those two.
amen.
And where we would diverge would be, I would say we need a lot more active learning and a lot less lecture. But I don't think that, abolishing the lecture is what we're after here.
Is that a question?
It's got to speak louder, I can't.
Can you please speak up, please?
Right.
Anybody want to take a crack at this? While you're thinking, I'll just say the technology can be extremely helpful in this. If you put problem sets online and the computer can tell whether or not you've gotten the solution right, they can individualize what the next problem will be so that all the students are working through completely different problem sets. So that's one way of doing it. Publishers often have amazing resources that you can use and are very much individualized. So that's one thing to do. There's a professor at Drexel University, a law professor and a business professor, who came up with a technique, and this is a technology one too, that's called ApprenNet, and it's available for free, but you have to subscribe. ApprenNet is where students rank each other's material, and then there's a ranking system so that the cream comes to the top and the rest fall down, and the teacher only has to grade the very top and the very bottom, and the students have graded each other through a wonderful system. It started with law schools. So that's a great way of individualizing, cutting down on the workload for the large class of the teacher who has to look at presentations of 500 students or 200 students or something. So technology can be a great way of individualizing and personalizing.
Yeah, what popped into my mind when you asked the question was a piece I read about a very large physics class, over 200 students. And what students did was to take a quiz on the material that was going to be covered in class. It was sort of a blended class, so they had some responsibility to get themselves a little bit up to speed with the material before they came to class. And before they came to class, they had to do an online quiz. And the online quiz was, graded automatically. So what the professor got before he or she, in this case it was a he, came to class was a printout of what problems had been most missed. And I think there's a way of scaling up so that you're going into class knowing those problems or those concepts that students didn't have clearly in mind.
That's called just-in-time teaching, if you're interested in looking at the methodology. Another question? Yes?
Oh, thanks.
for that. I am interested.
Right,
See student involvement
yeah.
in these.
Well, one of the things that Tom mentioned, which I think is, is something that a lot of faculty struggle with, is that when you start using learner-centered approaches, students resist. In part, they're resisting for the right reason, because it's more work for them, okay? If you're asking them to generate 3 examples of something, it's a lot harder for students to generate examples than it is to get a list of 3 good examples from the instructor. So it really depends on what your goal is. If your goal is just to have students have some examples, then you can go ahead and give them. You can go ahead and do a lecture with those, those examples. But if one of your goals is to teach students how to generate examples, see, then they need to be generating those. So the faculty often struggle with the resistance, because students will, just kind of like be in your face. You're the teacher, why are we teaching ourselves, What are we paying for here? So I think you have to be very clear about the educational rationale behind the approach that you're using, and being prepared to deal with, some of the issues of student resistance. There's a wonderful piece, old piece in the Journal of Engineering Education by Rich Felder and Rebecca Bent called Navigating the Bumpy Road to Student-Centered Instruction. It's just a classic. There's now another excellent piece in Cell Biology, Life Sciences Education by Kimberly Tanner and somebody else on student resistance too. So there's a lot of good stuff out there. And I think helping faculty recognize that resistance is part of the process. And it's not just resistance from students, sometimes it's resistance from colleagues, who
Chairs,
think, from
deans.
chairs who think that you are just the issues that we've talked about before, compromising your expertise, and abrogating professional responsibility. I think that faculty need to go into these approaches incrementally. I'm not much in favor of conversion experiences, where somebody goes to a workshop on learner-centered teaching and decides that they're going to be a whole new teacher the next day in class. I think it's a complex, iterative kind of process, where you sort of move through it and you try out different kinds of things to find out what does work for you.
Hi, Rebecca Wolf. I'm with Jobs for the Future. I direct an initiative called Students at the Center, and we actually focus on bringing research on primarily K-12 and secondary learning, motivation, everything that you've all been talking about, into what learner-centered designs would look like in K-12. So this has been really interesting to see how it's translated into the higher ed setting. And so I'm curious, given the struggles that we have right now, thinking about how to get secondary teachers to think more in these ways, where can they get support? I'm really struck by Thomas's arguments and some of the comment that was made over here around, and your answers in that it has to come from the top, it has to be the provost, it has to be in lieu of massive sea change in institutions saying we want to be student-centered, and somewhere in between leading lights like yourselves saying, I believe in it, I'm going to do it. What is in the middle for the adjuncts? What kind of supports are there? Where do they go to learn about this? What would inspire others in the meantime while we're trying to change the chancellors and the provosts? And how would more teachers and faculty start to do this?
My personal opinion is that they have to see that it works. That's the number
Good
one
point.
thing. So if I can say use knowledge building in my physics class, and there's clearly some buzz on the students' part, the math teachers see it, the chemistry teachers see it, what have you, that is in and of itself a good way to start scaling up. I know when I introduced knowledge building this semester, I had a lot of pushback from students, I still do, to be honest. But from colleagues in a physics department meeting, one of them said to me, oh, I see you're doing something new this semester. Well, that'll never work, and there was a lot of eye rolling and that sort of thing. So I think, persistence is, you need to believe in what you're doing. I also think that, sustained commitment to professional development, and I don't mean the one half day per year, sustained commitment where that is really elevated. And I think that does come from the top, is really important.
I think this sort of, I actually think that learner-centered teaching has not really infused across higher education from the top down. I think it's been bottom up. And I think it's been faculty who are facing students who are really passive, disconnected from learning. And I think that the appeal for the individual faculty member who may or may not have any kind of institutional support at all is being interested in teaching that promotes more and better learning. You see, so I mean, if you go to a faculty member and you say you want to improve your teaching, I mean, the typical response is, why? Did somebody tell you I needed to? You know? Whereas if you go to a faculty member and you say, are you interested in how much and how well your students learn? Well, you have to be a real curmudgeon to say no to that. And so you say, yes, of course I'm interested in that. And then we can say, well, let's talk about some of the things that we know from an empirical base, evidence-based practices that do promote more and better learning. And then so you think of faculty member, if you can say, here's something that a lot of faculty members have found works, why don't you try it? And then I think there gets to be, I mean, that was certainly how it happened to me. I didn't have a conversion experience, you know. I mean, I started messing around with some things, and I started messing around by giving students some choice about which assignments they did. And I could not believe how that affected their motivation in the course.
The good thing is, and I agree with Mary Ellen, that I think there would be a willingness for openness, because I've always been surprised throughout my long career how much each professor, even the curmudgeons, really care about what
Yes,
they've done in the
right,
classroom.
yes, you're right.
They really do. They worry about it. I myself say, this is not a good day, I failed, and I better do better the next time in the classroom. Don't forget that. These professionals have dedicated their lives, and they can do it in better ways that Mary Ellen and Phyllis are suggesting, but they do care, and
They do.
they bring it home. And they would be open to a sustained approach to try to improve what they're trying to do.
I think that sounds like a fabulous summary comment for this session, trying to improve, and they really care. So I want to thank you all for your participation.
Very good. Well, you certainly write beautifully.
Thank you.